Because government never knows when to stop, it will always squeeze tighter and tighter and push more and more. Always. Absolute mathematical certainty. Every human being has what I call a tolerance line in the sand. I'm willing to take so much, I'm not willing to take no more. Okay, now, it's different for everybody. Your tolerance line is different than mine. Mine is different than the next person. Okay, and that's the way it should be. Everybody is an individual. But everyone has that line in the sand. Because government does not know to stop. If it was smart, it would. But because government is not smart, it doesn't know to stop. It will always push people further and further and more and more and more, until more and more people have their tolerance line in the sand crossed. And when that happens, those people push back. Absolutely. Doesn't matter where your line in the sand is, when it's crossed, you do push back. So, inevitably, since government will squeeze tighter and tighter, more and more people will have their tolerance line in the sand crossed and will push back, until enough people push back that you have a revolution. That's inevitable. It must happen. That is what you're talking about when you say more and more people are waking up to the tyranny. Okay, it's inevitable. It has to happen. And it is happening. And it will continue to happen until enough people push back. There will be a revolution.
If the government wanted to create a situation that would drive the masses to not just conform and obey, but where they would literally want to conform and they would strive, they would want to conform and obey, where they would actually compete with each other to see who was more conformed, who was more obedient, or they would even attack everyone around them who was choosing not to conform and obey. Now, what type of situation would they choose if that was their goal? Would you argue their goal is to create a situation where your populace was more readily compliant, would just happily take direction from their government? And if that was the case, what situation would they choose? Clearly, they would choose a pandemic, possibly even a fake one, in order to drive them in that position, keep them in fear, and they would conform to what they were told.
Well, seeing as asked about the case-demic, so let me explain. Here we see many European countries, and they're all pretty much the same. Community immunity and the passing of the susceptible, like all viruses in history, has caused the death rate to come right down. Back here there was an epidemic with high death rates, sadly, of susceptible people, and now there is no epidemic by any reasonable definition because the death rates and ICU are right down. Here's Sweden, intensive care loading, they only reached around 60% of capacity, and that was in the epidemic. But now there's no epidemic and there's only 32 ICU beds in the whole of Sweden, 10.5 million people. And they had no lockdown, no masks, and they're kind of just completely back to normal here. But if you kept testing with PCR tests, as is happening all around Europe, you'd get a case-demic, and you could create a panic. I'll just show you a few countries and finish with that. Here's Spain. So we've recently, in the last month or two, got hyper-testing and lots of so-called cases, positive PCRs. But the deaths are gone. In fact, they disappeared pretty much in May. Belgium, same story. Case-demic out here with positive PCRs, but no deaths or ICU. Ended in May. France, bit of a case-demic here, but the deaths are gone and the impacts. And Netherlands, we got a big case-demic going on with lots of testing, but you'll see months have gone by with no deaths, so there is no following death or ICU problem. That's a case-demic.
Ask yourself this. If the government wanted to create a situation that would drive the masses to not just conform and obey, but where they would want to conform and obey, where they would compete, in fact, to see who was more conformed and more obedient, where they would even attack those around them who were choosing not to conform and obey. Now, what type of situation would they choose if that was their goal? Well, as it turns out, not all disasters are created equal, and you will never guess exactly the type of societal problem that numerous studies have found lead to exactly that. Or maybe you will. the study you're staring at right now. Pathogens in politics, further evidence. Further evidence that parasite prevalence predicts authoritarianism discusses how humans react to perceived threats and how that relates to the type of government that people will accept. Right? The point being that this scenario leads people to accept less freedom. Now the study focuses on the parasite stress, that's what they call it, the parasite stress hypothesis, which proposes that when a species, humanity, faces parasites, or rather just species in general, faces parasites or diseases, their values are shaped by that experience. Now in this context, parasite is used to refer to any pathogen organism, including bacteria and viruses. Now the theory states that depending on how a disease stresses people's development, that it can lead to differences in mating preferences and changes in culture. Now, proponents of the parasite stress theory also note that disease can actually alter the psychological and social norms of societies. So you should ask whether, that was the point. The objective, maybe. Now, according to a parasite stress hypothesis, the study reads, authoritarian governments are more likely to emerge in regions characterized by a high prevalence of disease-causing pathogens. Right, so in a general sense, places that have more pathogens tend to be more authoritarian. They define authoritarian governance as, quote, highly concentrated power structures that repress dissent and emphasize submission to authority, societal conformity, and hostility towards outgroup. Highly concentrated power structures that repress dissent, like what we being censored every other day, emphasize submission to authority, which is constant everywhere. I mean, that is constant. We're not all safe. No one's safe till we're all safe, right? Be a hero, wear a mask, right? Do what you're told. You have to submit to authority. Social conformity. Hostility towards outgroups. I mean, that is the nail on the head. Hostility towards anybody that doesn't conform to what they want. Now, it reads, due to the invisible nature of disease-causing parasites, attempts to control the spread of disease, quote, historically depended substantially on adherence to, quote, ritualized behavioral practices that reduced infection risk. Now, this says the researchers also found that society tends to promote collectivist worldviews. Now, it says, society tends to promote a collectivist worldview favoring obedience and conformity from the population. So in the scenario where you're underneath something like we're dealing with now, society tends to promote the idea of a collectivist view favoring obedience and conformity from everybody in response to the parasites. Now they examined 2 different studies, which themselves were analyses of previous works on the parasite stress theory itself and the implications for authoritarian tendencies in governments and individuals themselves. The first study shows that parasite prevalence strongly predicted the likelihood for individuals to express authoritarian personalities. It creates a situation where even individuals feel what it's saying is that it's likely that they will express them during that situation. But what I'm saying is that shows me that they feel comfortable enough to express them during that. That's really revealing. Now, this is the second study focused on small-scale societies and found that parasite prevalence, quote, predicted measures of authoritarian governance, and did so even when statistically controlling for other threats to human welfare. So again, even with a control measure, they can clearly see that the threat of a pandemic creates an authoritarian governance situation. Now again, ask yourself whether the governments aware of this may, be like, perfect. Let's make that happen.
Further ado, let's cut to the chase and take a look at an ordinary surgical mask, and I'm using a vape. As you can see, that vape, which has aerosols the same size as COVID-19 or larger, goes through and around a surgical mask. Now, if we take a cup mask and have a good look at it, here we go. Notice it goes right through the mask easily and goes in every direction. The aerosol is not affected by the mask in any material. Now we look at a surgical mask with a foam strip to protect above and keep my glasses from fogging. Lo and behold, the aerosols go all around it. It has no effect on me spreading aerosols to you. Now a cloth mask I borrowed from my wife. Once again, here we go, boom, straight through and around. It has no effect on the spread of aerosols. They go everywhere. And then I went and bought a guard mask with a high efficiency filter material. That one, here we go, watch for it. Through and around. It had no effect on the vape aerosol, which remember is the same size or larger. Now, I don't have an N95 mask. I have these shop respirators where they can put all kinds of things in them, but they're like an N95 because when you breathe out, everything goes out through a valve. guess what? It might protect me from you. It sure isn't going to protect you from me. Let's look at that again. Boom. Any mask with a button on it has a valve that lets everything go from you to your neighbor. It has no effect on anything. I think you can get the picture now. There is absolutely nothing that any of these masks do to protect you from me. And the fact is that unless I have a mask which is fully sealed, and where I breathe through the filter material both directions, and I have a really high quality filter, nothing is going to protect in either direction. Because just the same way that the vape went out, around, and through, it will come in, around, and through. Aerosols will not.
Now, it says, quote, at a psychological level of analysis, empirical evidence reveals that the subjective perception, hugely important, the subjective perception of infection risk causes individuals to be more conformist, to prefer conformity and obedience in others, to respond more negatively toward others who fail to conform, and to endorse more conservative socio-political attitudes. It doesn't matter if it's real or not. Just the subjective perception of a risk drives people to conform, drives them to obey, drives them to force others to obey. I just can't. This is probably the most important scenario. This is one of the most important things, in my opinion, in this whole scenario. There it is. Never let a crisis go to waste. It's the perfect thing to drive us to exactly where we want to go, the technocratic revolution. If you wanted a populace that was willing to do what they were told, who didn't really try to find new things and just happily trudged along in their mindless authoritarian scenario, well, create a situation where they're constantly under threat of pandemic. They'll be just that. Doesn't that seem like isn't that where we're going right now? It's never going to end, the new normal, we're always a threat, wearing masks, and it's just this constant fear of pandemic, and the flu and new things, and there's a bubonic plague popping up over there, everybody be scared. It creates exactly that. Driving people, is the real world scenario right where we are now not enough of an example? Does anybody think that's not accurate? Every single person we're coming across that is being blinded by the propaganda absolutely exhibits all of those things. Feeling that they can cross across the supermarket and be like, why aren't you wearing a mask? That's what that's talking about. And of course, driving them to blindly trust what the government tells them, despite everything that we have in our history to make that obviously a bad choice. As it says, simply put, where there is a high prevalence of parasitic diseases, the resulting stress on human health is likely to result in the emergence of authoritarian forms of governance. I mean, this is before we got here. They said they knew this would happen. The researchers note that the effect is consistent with previous research, which also found pathogen prevalence was uniquely linked to conformist attitudes and personality traits. Uniquely. So it's not like there's other disasters would fit the bill. Specifically, a pathogen risk is unique. The researchers examined the effects of malnutrition, warfare, famine, finding that only the threat of famine and pathogens correlate with authoritarian governance. Famine to a lesser degree. Specifically, virus threats are uniquely effective. That's what the study was clear about. But when you think about famine, weirdly enough, that famine and pathogens are the two main things that correlate in regard to creating authoritarian governments. Again, pathogens being more prevalent. It's seemingly the two primary tools of the very governments using this pandemic today. Am I wrong? Starvation and biowarfare. Look at any example around the world. What does that tell you? It seems to me that they're involved with creating exactly what they're trying to do here right now. Everywhere else, they're trying to create control, right? If you wanted to create control of an area to where you would drive that kind of conformity, well, you create those scenarios. Or that's what these studies are showing you. Isn't that interesting? Now, it says, quote, this conclusion is consistent also with psychological evidence showing that while others' threats can also influence individuals' conformist and ethnocentric attitudes, the perceived threat of infectious disease has effects that are empirically unique and also especially powerful. So, I wonder why they're using this now. Well, seeing as how we know that these entities do their research, we know that, I guess we can conclude that they're well aware of these studies themselves and what highly beneficial consequences arise from even the perceived threat of a pandemic. Beneficial to them, of course. So, need I say it? Is that what's happening right now?